This is the story of Richard Jaeckel, an actor who spent more than 50 years in Hollywood, appeared in close to 200 films and television shows, and still never became the kind of name people put on a marquee. He built one of the longest careers in the business by being the guy audiences recognized but couldn't quite name, and the weight of that grind, capped off by the way his life ended, is what makes his story worth telling. Jaeckel was born on October 10, 1926, in Long Beach, New York, and his childhood already had one foot in the entertainment world. His father ran the family fur business, and his mother worked as a stage actress, which meant young Richard grew up around performance even before he had any interest in it himself. His birth certificate listed only an initial R instead of a full first name, a small but strange detail for a man who would spend his adult life being recognized by millions of strangers who never learned much about him beyond his face. In 1934, when he was still a boy, his family packed up and moved from New York to Los Angeles so his father could open a West Coast branch of the fur business. That single relocation put a young Jaeckel directly in the orbit of the film industry at the exact moment it needed fresh faces for the war pictures that were about to define the decade. He didn't get his start through an audition or a talent scout combing through headshots. He got it while working as a mailboy at 20th Century Fox, delivering envelopes and packages through studio hallways where actual movies were being made just a few doors down. A casting director noticed something in him, and that chance encounter led directly to a role in the 1943 war film Guadalcanal Diary. He was still a teenager. What started as a summer job turned into a career that would eventually stretch across 6 decades, and it began with barely any effort on his part to make it happen. Before that career could pick up real momentum, though, the war intervened. Jaeckel served in the United States Merchant Marine from 1944 to 1946, right in the thick of World War II, at an age when most of his peers were still figuring out what they wanted to do with their lives. Merchant Marine sailors during the war ran some of the most dangerous supply routes in the conflict, hauling fuel, weapons, and troops across oceans patrolled by enemy submarines, and casualty rates in that service were higher proportionally than in most branches of the armed forces. Jaeckel came home from that service and picked his acting career back up almost exactly where he'd left it, which says something about how determined he was to make this work. By 1949, he was standing next to John Wayne in Sands of Iwo Jima, one of the most successful war films of the post-war era, and the momentum kept building from there. In 1950, he appeared in The Gunfighter, and by 1952, he was earning real praise for his performance in Comeback Little Sheba, playing a young suitor named Turk opposite Terry Moore. These weren't lead roles, but they were the kind of supporting work that built a reputation, and Jaeckel's reputation, film after film, was that of a dependable, believable presence who never once phoned it in. The 1950s also saw him move into television, appearing on anthology series like the U.S. Steel Hour and Playhouse 90, which were considered prestige programming at the time. Then in 1961, he joined the cast of Frontier Circus on CBS, playing an advance man for a traveling troupe making its way through the Old West. And that same year, he delivered what many consider one of his most difficult performances, playing one of 3 American soldiers accused of a brutal crime against a young German woman in town without pity. It was uncomfortable material, and Jaeckel handled it with a seriousness that stood out even in a crowded ensemble cast. By 1967, he'd landed one of the roles he's still remembered for, playing MP Sergeant Clyde Boren in The Dirty Dozen, the tough soldier assigned to keep watch over a squad of convicted criminals turned into commandos. The film was a massive success, one of the defining war pictures of its decade, and Jaeckel's role in it meant that even people who couldn't place his name had almost certainly seen his face. He'd reprised that same character nearly 2 decades later in a television sequel, which tells you how strongly that particular role stuck with both audiences and the people making decisions in Hollywood. Then came 1971, and the closest Jaeckel would ever get to real, formal recognition. He was cast in Sometimes a Great Notion, directed by Paul Newman and based on the Ken Kesey novel of the same name, playing a lumberjack named Joe Ben Stamper in a story about a stubborn logging family refusing to back down during a union strike. The production itself was rough from the start. Filming began in Newport, Oregon in June of 1970, and during rehearsals for a racing sequence, Newman himself crashed his motorcycle on a dirt slick and broke his ankle, forcing the production to adjust around its own director. Jaeckel's character meets a brutal end in the film, pinned by a falling log and then drowned in the rising river while his on-screen brother, played by Newman, desperately tries and fails to save him. Critics singled out that death scene specifically, calling it heartbreaking and technically remarkable, and it became the performance that finally got Jaeckel nominated for the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. That nomination was the one moment in nearly 30 years of steady work when the industry stopped and formally acknowledged him, and he lost. The award went to Ben Johnson for his performance in The Last Picture Show, a film that swept most of the major categories that year, and Jaeckel found himself up against a stacked field that also included Jeff Bridges, Leonard Fry, and Roy Scheider. Some who've looked back on that category since have argued Jaeckel earned his nomination almost entirely on the strength of that one drowning scene, and that in a weaker year he might have actually had a real shot at winning. He didn't get a second chance. There was no follow-up nomination waiting for him later in his career. That single loss in 1972 marked the ceiling of what Hollywood was willing to give him, no matter how much more work he put in afterward. And he kept working, because that's what he did. He appeared in Alzana's Raid in 1972 and Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid in 1973, working again with directors Sam Peckinpah on the kind of gritty revisionist Western that defined that era of American film. In 1975, he reteamed with Paul Newman once more for The Drowning Pool, and by 1977, he was appearing in Twilight's Last Gleaming, a Cold War thriller about a hijacked nuclear missile silo. Through it all, he was never the star of the poster, but he was almost always somewhere in the credits doing the job. Television work never let up either. In 1980, he starred opposite Linda Lavin in the CBS television movie The $5.20 an Hour Dream, a performance that was well received at the time, and through the early 80s he took on comedic material as well, appearing in Airplane 2, the sequel, in 1982, and playing the by-the-book security chief, Major Hawkins, on the ABC sitcom At Ease in 1983. In 1984, he took on one of his more memorable later roles, playing the government agent hunting Jeff Bridges' alien character across the country in John Carpenter's Starman, a film that earned a real critical respect and gave Jaeckel a chance to work opposite the same actor he'd once been nominated against at the Oscars more than a decade earlier. In 1985, he returned to the character that had defined so much of his career, reprising Sergeant Clyde Bowen for the television sequel, The Dirty Dozen Next Mission, and that same year he showed up on Spencer for hire as Lieutenant Martin Quirk. The 1990s brought a strange final chapter to his career. He took roles in martial arts films like The King of Kickboxers in 1990 and Martial Outlaw in 1993, genres about as far from his war movie roots as it's possible to get, and yet he approached them with the same professionalism that had carried him through 5 decades of work. In 1989, he joined the cast of Baywatch, a show that would go on to become one of the most watched television programs in the world, playing Lieutenant Ben Edwards, the older, steadier presence surrounded by a much younger cast built around lifeguard action and beach glamour. It was, in its own way, a fitting final act. Jaeckel had spent his entire career being the reliable veteran standing just off to the side of the real spotlight, and here he was doing exactly that one more time on the most-watched show on the planet. In 1992, the industry gave him one more honor, awarding him a Golden Boot Award, a recognition specifically given to actors and filmmakers who built their careers in Western films and television, a genre Jaeckel had worked in since practically the beginning of his career. By that point, it functioned less as a career-launching honor and more as an acknowledgement of everything he'd already put in. His final screen credit came in 1994, closing out a career that had run for more than 50 consecutive years without a real break, from a teenage male boy discovered by accident to a veteran character actor who'd worked with John Wayne, Paul Newman, and Jeff Bridges, sometimes more than once each. The tragedy in Richard Jaeckel's story isn't a secret, and it isn't hidden behind some shocking twist. It's the slow, grinding kind the sort that doesn't make headlines because it plays out over decades instead of a single dramatic moment. He worked harder and longer than most of the people around him ever had to, got exactly one real shot at industry-wide recognition, and lost it to a stacked category in a single ceremony he never got another shot at. Then, in the final stretch of his life, that decades-long grind gave way to an entirely different kind of fight. Jaeckel battled melanoma for 3 years, and on June 14, 1997, he died at the Motion Picture and Television Hospital in Woodland Hills, California, a facility built specifically to care for people who'd spent their lives in the industry that had, in its own complicated way, both made him and never quite let him become a star. He was 70 years old. He left behind his wife, Antoinette Marchese, who had married him in 1947 and stayed with him for the full 50 years until his death, a marriage that outlasted nearly every trend, fad, and studio system change. Hollywood went through during that stretch. He also left behind 2 children, including his son Barry Jaeckel, who went on to build his own career as a professional golfer, carrying the family's work ethic into a completely different field. Richard Jaeckel never lived a double life, and he didn't need one to be interesting. He lived one very long, very demanding single life, almost entirely in service to a career that rarely gave him the credit he'd earned along the way, and that quiet, decades-long persistence, carried all the way from a Fox Studios mailroom to nearly 200 film and television credits, is the real story worth remembering about him.